Chapter 16, Pea Vines and Mathematics. Early on a summer morning in 1860, Gregor Mendel, in his long monk's habit, pushed open the door of the white-walled monastery of Altbrunn in Austria and walked along a gravel path to a small vegetable patch, neatly planted with pea vines. The red edge of the sun was just pushing up over the Austrian hills. Trees and shrubs in the quiet monastery grounds were beginning to take shape. No one stirred. Even the birds sounded sleepy. Gregor Mendel walked quickly. The pea vines were in flower, and he wanted to reach them before the bees started to carry pollen from one to another. He shut the gate of the vegetable garden behind him and started to work. He was very fat, and his monk's habit interfered with his movements, but his hands were skillful. He had worked in exactly this way every summer for nearly 11 years. The red and white peas were in full flower. The vines that had been trained up on strings, and some of them were supported on twigs or short poles. With a little brush, Mendel took the pollen from a red pea blossom and dusted it carefully on the pistil of a white pea. Then he tied the bag over the flower that he had fertilized in this way and moved over to the next flower. The patch measured about 20 feet by 120, so the work was tedious. It was mid-morning before he finished his curious task. Gregor Mendel was used to working with growing things. He had been born in the country, the son of poor Austrian peasants. But it was early evident that he had a quick mind. The master at that village school noticed that he was particularly good at mathematics. So somehow, though they had little money, his parents managed to send him to a higher school 20 miles away, and worried because they could not pay full board. They sent him bread and butter from home every time the carrier went that way. After he had finished school, the boy entered the monastery at Altbrunn, and there, according to the monastic custom, he chose a new name. His parents had christened him Johann. Now he was to be Gregor. The superiors of the monastery recognized, too, that the boy had a quick mind. They sent him to the University of Vienna for 3 years. After that, he came back to the monastery to teach and to make the experiments with beans and peas that interested him so much. For though the prelate of the monastery had said that Gregor Mendel, quote, lived blamelessly, piously, and religiously, unquote, and though he was a good teacher who explained things simply to his pupils, he cared above everything else for the experiments he was making with his beans and peas. He had worked at them for nearly 11 years, and by the summer of 1860 his experiments were nearly completed. He felt that he had solved a great mystery, that he had discovered a natural law whose existence no one had guessed before. Soon he would be ready to tell the world about it. Standing in his monk's garb, with his pea blossoms carefully tied up, each in its little bag, he must have smiled to himself before he went back through the great door to his other duties in the monastery. The problem on which he'd been working was a hard one. No one who did not have an observing eye and a good mind for mathematics would have tried it, but Gregor Mendel had both. He was studying heredity. Whatever he could prove from watching bean and pea vines would be true for other living plants and animals, he thought. He knew, as did all scientists in his day, that in the living world like tends to produce like, that the offspring of plants, as well as of animals, tend to be like their parents. He knew that the only substances that passes from one generation to another were the microscopic egg and sperm in animals and their equivalent in plants, except for single-celled animals who reproduce by dividing, or the plants that increase by budding. But how this thread of life was carried down from one generation to another, whether a human being inherited his qualities equally from both parents, whether he inherited anything from his grandparents or from his remote ancestors, these were things he did not know. He thought he could find them out through his work with the pea blossoms in the garden patch. It had been a long time since the idea had first come to him. He had always been interested in gardening, and in his early years at the monastery he had tried to produce new colors in his flowers. Soon he noticed that the flowers called hybrids, which were a mixture of two stalks, kept producing certain colors with extraordinary regularity. He would make a chart of these hybrids and their offspring, he thought. It seemed strange that no one had of doing this before. Perhaps in this way he could explain the great variety of species in plants and animals. After Mendel had experimented with more than 2,000 pea vines, he was ready to put the natural law he had discovered into words. When he crossed red flowers with white flowers, the hybrids were uniformly red. In the next generation, however, when he cross-fertilized these red blossoms with white ones, 1/3 of the resulting blossoms were always red, 1/3 mixed red and white, the other third white. The red color he called the dominant characteristic, the white the recessive. Now he experimented with other characteristics, with peas whose skin were wrinkled and smooth, those with tall vines or short, those whose seed coats were white, grayish, brown, or yellow. Always the dominant recessive characteristics appeared in the same proportions. He saw now that inheritance was not a matter of blending, that the reproductive cells were a little mosaic, bearing characteristic qualities of both parent plants or animals, and he could predict in advance exactly the kind of proportion of the members of each new generation, an ability that was to be very valuable to animal breeders and plant growers in the future. In 1864, in a fine copperplate hand, he wrote a brief paper explaining the phenomenon of inheritance he had discovered. There was a meeting of the Brünn Society for the Study of Natural Science in February 1865. Gregor Mendel was invited to read his paper to its members. Although the night was extremely cold, a few members turned out. Among them were botanists, a chemist, a geologist, and an astronomer. They listened politely enough to the account of his work with pea vines, though it is questionable whether what he said was very clear to them. There was not time for him to finish. He would complete his paper with special attention to his mathematical calculations at the March meeting, he said. Scarcely one attended the March meeting. Those who did come hardly followed the argument at all. Botany and mathematics were an unheard of combination, they said. It was the custom of the Brünn Society to send copies of its proceedings to other scientific societies. Copies of Mendel's paper were therefore duly made and sent to Vienna, Berlin, Rome, St. Petersburg, and Uppsala. But no one paid any attention to them. Perhaps they were not even read. A monk with a theory of heredity completely at variance with the prevailing thought of the day, a monk who mingled botany and mathematics, why should anyone pay heed to him? Yet Gregor Mendel felt sure that what he had discovered was important. A year or two later, he was writing to Carl Wilhelm Nageli, the renowned Swiss botanist. Would Nageli care to see a little paper he had written, he asked. Nageli was bad-tempered and in poor health, but he agreed to read Mendel's paper. Afterward, he wrote Mendel that the monk seemed to have, quote, made a beginning, unquote. Mendel still believed in the discovery he had made. He went on with his experiments, working with hybrids of 4-o'clocks and of maize, with dandelions, and with hawkweed. The monastery disapproved of his working with animal specimens. As he grew older, the work grew increasingly difficult because of his corpulence. And with the dandelions and the 4-o'clocks, he needed to use a microscope, which caused him severe eye strain. Nevertheless, he planned to continue in spite of bodily difficulties and lack of recognition. But in 1868, he was chosen to be head of the monastery at Alpen. He took the post with regret. He wanted to go on with his teaching and his work in heredity. Perhaps, he thought, he would be able to devote a larger part of the monastery grounds to his experiments. He wanted, too, to experiment with honeybees and fruit trees. But in less than 6 years, he fell into a bitter struggle with the German government. They wanted to tax the monastery, and Mendel maintained they had no right to do so. For several years, he tried to fight the government, and this took so much time and strength that his scientific studies had to be set aside. He died at the monastery in 1884. A great crowd of mourners came to his funeral. They were not only the priests and monks, but a Protestant clergyman, a Jewish rabbi of Albrunn, representatives of the scientific society, professors, teachers, and townspeople. They mourned him with genuine grief, for they had loved him. But no one at that time seemed to realize that they were burying the body of a great scientist on whose discoveries students of heredity would base their work for generations to come. They thought of him simply as a good man. The years passed. In 1900, in laboratories in 3 separate countries, 3 scientists working separately came to the same conclusion. Hugo de Vries, the Dutchman, Karl Correns, the German, and Schermach, the Austrian, all pointed out that their findings corroborated exactly what Mendel had discovered years before. Now the world awoke slowly to the importance of Gregor Mendel's work. The townspeople of Albrunn collected money in 1911 to erect a marble statue to him. On it he stands in his monk's habit, the beans and pea vines around him, and underneath is the inscription, "To the Investigator of Nature, P. Gregor Mendel, 1822 to 1884." Under this inscription, in low relief, are the figures of a man and woman kneeling with joined hands. They are intended to show the importance that the old monk's work will have to human life of future generations.